Back when I was 4 years old, when my brother got Sonic Adventure 2 for the Sega Dreamcast, I thought to myself, damn, I think Shadow the Hedgehog might be the coolest thing to ever exist. Then, when I was 8, I got Shadow the Hedgehog for the PlayStation 2, and as I was watching that opening cinematic, deafened by the gunshot noise when you start the game, I thought to myself, damn, I think Shadow the Hedgehog might be the coolest thing to ever exist. Now, I'm 27. I'm much older and wiser, and I've experienced more of what the world has to offer other than just cartoon hedgehogs that love Latinas, and I can now confidently say that I know for a fact that Shadow the Hedgehog is, and forever will be, the coolest thing to ever exist. With that being said, the Shadow the Hedgehog video game from 2005, with all of its mid-2000s tribal tattoo majesty, does leave a lot to be desired, and while I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as the internet likes to make out, it could do with some extra polish. Luckily, this is where Shadow the Hedgehog Reloaded comes in. Howdy gamers, I'm Kraft, and this is Hidden Potential, a series where we showcase and review fan-made mods, patches, and remakes of games both good and bad to see just how much we can fix / improve upon them. Now, Shadow the Hedgehog's problem is not that there isn't a good game at its core, but just that you really have to dig down to that core to be able to find it. And unfortunately, there's just several really badly placed design decisions that really hamper the experience. The three main offenders of this lie within the game's control, mission structure, or rather gameplay flow, and its progression, although there are plenty of other smaller problems that do really build up and add to the frustration too. First, let's talk about the control, most notably the physics and momentum, the foundation of what makes up most of Sonic's gameplay. Being built off the engine and assets of Sonic Heroes, Shadow the Hedgehog inherited a lot of the same problems that game also had, most notably how slippy the game is, feeling like it's on ice most of the time. It can feel very floaty at times, which is not ideal when it's a game about moving quickly, and the fact that it's built around Shadow's jet shoes can arguably make that problem even worse. With that being said, with this single playstyle in mind, the game is better designed around it, with much wider pathways to accommodate Shadow's more unruly acceleration. And thanks to this being a iterative sequel built off the back of the previous one, it means that Shadow in general has a lot more polish compared to Heroes. Stuff like grind rails and wall jumping are much better implemented and are much less buggy now. Although, as to be expected with a platformer that relies on high speeds and momentum-based gameplay, not to mention one that was also built off of one that already had issues of its own, it does have quite a few problems under the hood. Stuff like the lightspeed dash, for example, is just as temperamental as it's ever been. The second core issue is that the game's overall flow is a little bit all over the place. The idea of guns is one that actually makes a good deal of sense with how they're expected to be used. If Shadow has a gun in his hand, he can take down enemies and obstacles in his way without having to break any pace. You're able to maintain that sense of flow all the time. Unfortunately, it's one that doesn't end up working like this, and a lot of the whole gun mechanic can tend to make the game feel very stop-starty instead of increasing the pace. The problem lies with the fact that the weapons tend to drop from enemies pretty slowly after you take them out, meaning that anytime you do kill an alien for its weapon, you'll just have to stand still just for a second to wait for it to become available. The idea is that you can and will swipe down and pick up any gun that you run across without losing any pace, and you'll even be able to discard and swap weapons while at top speed if you time it right. Unfortunately, Shadow's unwieldy movement can make this a bit hard, so the natural choice is to just slow down a bit, but at lower speeds, Shadow will stand still to do the pickup animation. It's relatively minor, but since you've already had to stop and wait for the weapon to drop in the first place, and you've had to slow down to pick it up, these relatively small speed bumps all add up and they don't feel good being right next to each other. Now, if you see top level players speedrunning these levels and getting the best possible times, you'll see tactful use of skipping certain weapons and grabbing others, and skilled timing to grab these weapons the moment they hit the floor, while also gaining decent speed before doing so. There can be good flow to this game, but it's not intuitive or natural to the average player and really bogs things down. But the biggest cause for problems of this game's overall flow is the hero versus dark mission structure. Much like the guns, it's a good idea in theory having different objectives that determine your morality and path through the story, but unfortunately it's one that's a detriment to the game's core design, and what you get out of it is really not worth the downsides. Many people when playing Shadow for the first time usually almost always end up getting the neutral ending, as the neutral objective in every mission is usually get to the finish line, which is a lot easier and naturally more fun than the commonly used find every enemy from this faction and hunt them down like the dogs they are. The problem with these is that in a game all about speed, you'll spend a lot of time checking corners and scavenging and hunting around for that one last gun soldier that was hiding behind a destructible wall or something. You gotta go fast, but unfortunately, you can't afford to. Now, that's not to say all the missions are bad. Personally, I don't think the one where you hit switches as you run through the level are really that offensive, and I actually really like the ones where you're chasing down a sort of mini-boss that's running away from you and you have to keep up with it whilst also chipping away at its health throughout the level. The missions, if you're lucky, have an element of speed tied directly to the mission structure, but if you're not, unfortunately have mission objectives that are just at odds with the core identity of the Sonic series, and sadly, for the brunt of what's available, many of these range from being a chore to an absolute ball ache. Sorry Maria, but you need to be punished for asking me to do the most drawn out shit known to man. Funnily enough, however, these sort of missions where you're going very slowly and scavenging around these fast levels have been in Sonic games before. Stuff like finding the lost Chow in every stage of Sonic Adventure 2 and like all of the chaotic stuff in Heroes mimic a lot of what Shadow is trying to do with some of these missions. The thing is, those missions either were, or at least felt like pretty optional stuff that was tacked onto the game to add a little bit of replay value, as you could still enjoy 90% of the game without engaging with it whatsoever. If you didn't want to do it, you could simply just not do it. With Shadow, however, it's evenly spread throughout the entire game, and if you want to experience those different story paths, you will have to engage with it sooner or later. And you will want to experience the different story paths, because otherwise you're going to be stuck playing a lot of Westopolis, which is the cornerstone for the third major drawback that gives people grievances with Shadow the Hedgehog. That being the game's progression. Because in order to beat the game, you will need to get the game's 10 endings, with 2 different outcomes for each of the game's 5 possible final stages. And unfortunately, you have to restart each playthrough from stage 1. You're not allowed to pick up from a midpoint and choose a different story decision to set yourself down a different path. Which means that you'll have to beat the game's first stage, Westopolis, a minimum of 10 times, providing you don't fuck up a route. And even if you spread out your playthroughs pretty evenly, you'll still need to play the 3 possible second stages 3 or 4 times each as well. Now, replaying stages in a Sonic game is not exactly a chore, not usually at least. They're short and sweet, and their arcadey nature means that they're designed to be replayed. It's why people still play them for years after the fact. The same can be said for stuff like Resident Evil or Devil May Cry. But doing it every now and then out of choice is very different from being forced to do it to unlock the big cinematic end of the game, especially when that game is not exactly Sonic Team's magnum opus to begin with, and that's what does feel like a chore. And all of this is only magnified when trying to unlock possibly the game's biggest saving grace being its expert mode. What sounds like is just a hard difficulty is actually an entirely separate mode that reworks and sometimes extends every single level to just be a more traditional race to the finish Sonic level. You get to play full, complete versions of every stage without most of the problems that I talked about in the gameplay flow section. They are moderately more difficult, but the differences are pretty negligible, and the real challenge actually comes from the fact that it is a gauntlet, and if you run out of lives, you have to start from Westopolis for yet another time. There is unfortunately no way to play these later stages without tackling the earlier ones first, so if there is a stage that you really like in particular, I hope you're playing on an emulator so you can make a save state to play it whenever you want. Putting minor problems like this aside, however, the real issue with this mode is how you unlock it. Considering everything you have to go through to unlock the true final level and boss of the game, you'd assume it would be a reward for doing those two things. But to unlock Expert Mode, you need to get an A rank on every single mission on every single stage. Unlocking Metal Sonic or Green Hill Zone in Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 were pretty tedious tasks, but asking a player to perfect every single stage 2 or 3 times to unlock the ability to play those stages again is honestly just ridiculous, especially when ideally this is how many people just want to play the game. Luckily, with emulation or hacked consoles, the ability to download saves is an option, and some brave soul out there has unlocked every possible route for us, so thank you Asian Man 2001, thank you for your service. Now, with all of this being said, good god, I've been yapping for over 10 minutes here, I'll leave a timestamp below, it's fine. Let's talk about the actual subject of this video being the overhaul mod that is Shadow the Hedgehog Reloaded. This mod is available for the GameCube version of the game and sets out primarily to make it less tedious in general, but also implements various level tweaks, cut content and new mechanics into the game, as well as several bug fixes and minor graphical tweaks. To mirror our sort of mini review of the base game earlier, let's start out by talking about what the mod does to player control. The changes that I appreciated the most being the tweaks to Shadow's movement and handling. Funnily enough, they actually made Shadow a bit faster than he is in the vanilla game, which on paper certainly sounds like a choice considering how unruly he was to control before, but thanks to other tweaks that are made, he's actually a lot more responsive now too, and it does more than enough to cancel out any problems that could have been caused by that speed increase. Shadow would originally have this sort of dead zone mechanic whenever you were running forward, where the game would limit analog stick adjustments the faster you moved. The idea is probably that it helps you keep moving in a straight line easier, something that's probably a holdover from the PS2 port, since the GameCube having a hexagonal stick gate means that it wouldn't be a problem on that controller. In practice, however, it just ends up making Shadow's movement feel really sluggish, and when you end up pushing the stick further to be able to turn more while sprinting, you'll suddenly hit this point where you switch from turning, let's say, 15 degrees to 50 degrees in an instant. In Reloaded, this is either gone or heavily reduced, so adjustments you make are reflective to what actually happens in game. It hardly reinvents the wheel, but it does put snow chains on them for better traction, and considering how slippy the original felt, this is very much appreciated. Also, things like the lightspeed dash are usable in certain areas they weren't before, like during the skydiving sections and such. And I'm not sure if this is a placebo effect or not, but it felt more reliable in Reloaded too. They're really small changes in the grand scheme of things, but they do really help with making the game feel a lot tighter. And they help maintain that high-speed gameplay, meaning overall, the peaks are higher and the valleys aren't quite as low. Another substantial thing that got changed is the game's melee combat. You're able to switch between the old and new styles by pushing the Z button, so you're able to still do the more typical style of attacks, but now there is an option that allows you to deal damage while maintaining all of your speed. The new style pretty much has no animations to it whatsoever. Holding down the B button just makes the weapon an active hitbox, and Shadow's existing run and jump animations while those weapons are equipped basically become the new sword swings that hit enemies. What's really cool about this, on top of being able to hit enemies while you run past them, is that stuff like the jump allows you to hit enemies multiple times in less than a second. This will absolutely melt the durability of a weapon, but also the health bar of the enemy that you're fighting. And this is really cool because melee weapons didn't really have a place in the game's original sandbox, they were just kind of there. And it just makes use of all of those redundant buttons on the controller that Shadow the Hedgehog just didn't really use. And speaking of which, the mod also makes use of the L button, which you can now hold down when doing a homing attack to override it with a jump dash, even when enemies are about. Personally, I kept forgetting that this was an option and thus didn't really use it all that much, but the extra layer of control is never a bad thing, since the homing attack in the 3D Sonic games has always been a bit of a point of contention for some, as there are moments where it does make you do something that you weren't intending to do. Finally, the vehicles also got a bit of a rework to make them a bit less redundant. The walkers are a bit more nimble and faster to use in general, making them a little bit more fun to actually use. The air sources are less floaty and have like a downward spike instead of a double jump, meaning they're less frustrating to use, and the cars can now go really quickly if you mash the accelerator. It's still a system that's kind of only there for the rule of cool or very specific gameplay sections, but that small modicum of extra substance is nice. The real improvements that everyone will be able to appreciate, however, is the new tweaks to the mission structure. In general, depending on their objective, missions have been made significantly less tedious. Namely, any mission that has the kill all of the blank soldiers as its objective has had its count reduced quite a bit, and on top of that has even had a few new enemies added to it, so the level is technically a little bit more difficult, but also making the missions a lot more palatable. Instead of having to take out all 45 enemies in this scavenger hunt of a quest, you now have to take out, let's say, 42 of the 51 enemies. Personally, I still found myself going a little bit slow through the missions thanks to how the vanilla game has conditioned me to play them, but combing through the environment for enemies to absolutely make sure you can actually complete the mission objective without any backtracking is no longer a necessity, and you can just focus on moving forward now. You can also lock in on a mission by pressing up on the D-pad, so you don't have to constantly switch back when you're trying to focus on a specific one. There's also been some small tweaks to the levels themselves. The secret door mechanic has been scrapped entirely, with them just being open or behind destructible walls now, and the collectible keys have been replaced with red rings as a little I did it completion bonus. I will say that some of these are in some nonsensical locations at times. I get that the creator is going for this sort of you've got to exploit the mechanics just right to get these mentality when placing them, and I think that's fine, but for your average player, even one downloading a mod like this isn't likely going to know how to get some of these. Now, this is fine for small, nothing collectibles, but this mentality does crop up elsewhere in a way that I'm not the biggest fan of, but we'll get to that in a little bit. The other noticeable changes that are worth mentioning are that things like forced waiting sections, like elevators and the like, are now much faster and get you into the action much quicker. Alternatively, thanks to some other changes, some of them are now skippable, which can be very satisfying providing you have the skill to do so. The other really big selling point of this mod, however, is what it does to the game's progression, because now the game is significantly more available to people who don't want to replay the same content over and over again to see that true ending and final boss. Last Story now unlocks after only 3 different story endings opposed to needing all 10. This means that if you do a good, evil, and neutral run, you'll be able to quote-unquote beat the game, seeing at least one variant of every single one of its boss fights and most of the levels that the game has to offer without much retreaded ground. You do still have to play Westopolis 3 times, unfortunately. There is still more to play through and chew on afterwards, but the simple fact that you no longer have to be forced to do so does make this an absolute breath of fresh air and gives anybody thinking of replaying the game or giving it a shot after loving the peak fiction that is Shadow Generations a much more approachable way of enjoying the game. Expert mode is also unlocked much earlier, with the new requirement being just beating the last story instead of having to A rank every single mission of every single stage, and the new expert mode variants of the levels are actually available in the level select screen by pressing the X button when selecting them instead of A. However, this version of expert mode is actually quite a bit different to the usual one. You can no longer pick up rings after getting hurt, and the levels have been remixed even more so it's actually a bit more challenging, and even asks you to do stuff like using the spin dash to launch Shadow across huge gaps that you'd never have to do normally. It's a really cool set of ideas, but it does ask you to engage in ways that are usually only used for things like shaving off your record time or finding secrets in other Sonic games, and instead makes all of that stuff mandatory. It definitely feels like a quote-unquote expert mode now, and I do like this in concept, but the changes to Shadow's movement can only do so much. But stuff like spin dash launching just doesn't feel anywhere near as good as the adventure games, and I kinda wish I had the option to be able to choose the original expert mode with all of the other reloaded changes too. Every other change that this mod brings are far less substantial than what I've talked about so far, but are pretty neat as well. There's some cut and unused dialogue and music on the disc that has been re-implemented into places where it would be relevant. Even if you don't end up downloading and playing this mod, I do recommend looking up the tracks Who I Am and Broken, because these are 2 full songs with lyrics and everything that are just lost Shadow songs. I mean, they're by no means I Am All of Me or All Hail Shadow, but they're still pretty interesting to listen to. And most of the visual changes are bug fixes, fixing stuff like a glowing eye effect that wasn't properly implemented, or a hand animation that just didn't play on the GameCube version of the game. What I did find funny is that they have changed Maria's eyes a little bit in the flashback missions to make her look a little bit less uncanny, and Chaos Emeralds do look a little bit darker in cutscenes compared to the original release. It's pretty much a preference thing, but I do think it looks a little bit better like this. There are free changes, however, that are especially nice. Stuff like Dolphin Emulator does have the ability to widescreen hack the game into being, well, widescreen, but doing so in this sort of brute force way does mean that while the game is in proper widescreen, stuff like the UI will be stretched. Not to mention that certain things to the very right or left hand of the screen have the potential to pop out of existence before they're fully off screen. So having proper widescreen support as an option for this mod is very nice. And if you download like a really small texture pack, you have the option to reduce, or rather upscale, the bloom effect for HD resolutions, which is an area that can look a little bit sloppy when you're just using an emulator to up-res something. So having these two things does just make everything a little bit cleaner looking and makes it look like a bit of a proper release. And the final change is that the palette for some of the similar looking stages that reuse a lot of assets have been changed and tweaked slightly to better differentiate similar looking stages. Now, personally, I didn't notice any changes, so I imagine they're not super big, but the attempt was there, and I'm certainly not going to complain. Actually, one thing that I've not mentioned yet, because I forgot to put in my script, is that with a few tweaks to the emulator, this mod also allows you to play the game at a much more locked 60 FPS. Now, the original game also runs at 60, but there are a number of places where it does cause a bit of slowdown. So if you are playing this mod and you've got a pretty decent computer, there's a few changes that you'll want to make in the settings to get it to just run that much better. Do make sure that you absolutely set this up properly, however, because if you're like me and you don't, then you'll have this message pop up multiple times. And every time it does, there's like a 25 to 50% chance that the game's gonna crash. But yeah, all in all, Shadow the Hedgehog Reloaded is a very good mod that I absolutely recommend to you if you're going to play this game. Whether it's that you've heard all of the bad things about this game over the years and you want to give it a go, but because of all of that you want to try and make it the best possible experience you can, or maybe you're somebody who has played it in the past but hasn't beaten it, so you want to give it another go and actually finish it this time, but you think about those 10 different endings and you go, yeah, I'm not putting that much time into it for this one small desire. It's just a great mod all around that will make it just so much more accessible to you. It's not going to move heaven and earth. Like many of these mods, it can only do so much, but it is overall a much nicer experience. And if you're a die-hard Sonic fan who likes all of these weird speedrunning techniques and whatnot, that new expert mode is definitely something I'd recommend you giving a go. And really, that's the only thing that I would not recommend about this mod, is the lack of the original expert mode. If you're looking for a more casual run through the game, or like a really die-hard one, this mod is great. But if you are in that very, very specific sour spot in between the two, where you kind of want a bit more out of just the base game, but you don't really want to lean on this really high level stuff, then it can be a little bit of a bummer. But other than that, I absolutely recommend it, and if you want to, by all means go out and play it. And with that, I'll see you next time.